seminar class. There's only 3 people, I believe. So if you're one of those 3, please put your name on the sheet. And yeah, it'd be good to put faces to the names too, because I'm the co-instructor of that class. Yeah, and so without further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Mike Chamberlain. So here's Mike. Mike was actually my master's advisor, so I've known him for quite some time. Mike got his BS at Virginia Tech, his MS and his PhD at Mississippi State. Worked, I think, his first faculty job at Louisiana State, which is where I met Mike. And I studied bears with him, but as you all know, a lot of what he does is study wild turkeys. And I think he just told me he's been doing it for 30 years. So hopefully we'll learn a lot about wild turkeys. And yeah, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Mike.
Thanks, John. Am I mic'd up here? You hear me? Yay? Good. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here. So I was charged with coming up with a catchy title for a seminar to talk about a bird that I've discovered many people in society really don't care much about. And there's a lot of misconceptions about turkeys, that they drown themselves in a hard rain and all these weird things. So I figured a catchy title would be something like things that we thought we already knew. But the reality of it is the last 10 plus years of my research has basically been about this. Learning things that I thought we already knew with certainty. In fact, a lot of the work I've published in the past decade negated work I published in the previous decade. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So, or maybe I'm not actually. No, I'm not. Let's do this. No, I'm not talking to you about anything. So this first slide, what could if I can spend 40 minutes talking about the first slide. Let's see. Mouse work.
Okay, so the keyboard definitely works.
Keyboard didn't work.
Mouse and keyboard are working.
Okay. Okay. So before I talk about kind of the meat of what I put together, I wanted to give you like a 101 of wild turkeys, because if you understand this stuff, then the data I'm going to show you makes sense and means something. If you don't know anything about turkeys, then what I talk to you about really is somewhat pointless. So wild turkeys are the largest galliform in North America. They're largely gregarious, meaning they spend most of their time around each other. Really, the only time that they don't conform to that is when females are nesting. So 12 months a year, males are spending time around each other. 11 months of the year, females are spending time around each other. So they're supposed to be together. They're supposed to be social. They have pronounced social hierarchies, dominance hierarchies. So within these groups of turkeys, there's a socially dominant bird, there's a second bird, a third bird, a fourth bird, and these are pronounced, and they maintain these throughout their life until a dominant bird dies. So as long as the dominant bird is present, these hierarchies are very stable. Turkeys are large, so females are up to my knee or slightly above, but their night vision sucks. So they can't see well at night, so to avoid predation, they get in a tree because they can't detect predation as it's coming. They have excellent vision during the day, but it's completely compromised at night. So they sleep in trees. Unlike other game birds in North America, they're hunted primarily in their spring reproductive season. So although there are fall hunting seasons, the sexiest hunting season for turkeys is during the spring, and that's when the bulk of harvest occurs, which is unique. And if you look across the last 2 decades or so, populations have been in this slow, precipitous decline, wherein over the past 20 years, populations in many states are 50% or more below where they were, say, around 2000. So that's prompted quite a bit of research on the bird. If you look at this bird, they've been extensively studied. There have been literally hundreds and hundreds of published articles on wild turkeys covering every gamut of the species ecology, but we've missed the mark in a number of ways. And two of the things that prompted kind of us to miss the mark are these GPS units in the bottom left. Turkeys are really wonky. So when they're foraging and they tip up to feed, they put their head down to feed. Weight matters. So until the advent of GPS that was super light, it was very difficult to mark a wild turkey with a heavy transmitter. They don't tolerate them well. That combined with the collection of genetic information has really kind of opened our eyes. And this is a student that's collecting blood from a brachial vein on a hen. Put those two together and we've kind of learned in the past 4 or 5 years a lot of the things that we thought we already understood. So if you look at this bird, they're obnoxious, they're bright, they have head ornaments, fleshy, they vocalize, it's called gobbling, they display for each other. They use these displays that are driven by sexual selection. They're gregarious, they practice these courtship displays in groups often, and their mating system hinges on attracting a lot of attention, so they're showy and gaudy. That's by design. They have those social hierarchies, and within those hierarchies, things are very stable. So within that group of toms right there, there's one socially dominant bird, and the other two are under him. And as long as he stays alive, that social hierarchy doesn't wane. As soon as he dies, then there's disarray and chaos, and it resets itself. And they use a form of lekking as their mating system. When you hear the word lek, you don't, what do you think about when you hear lek? Like sage grouse, right? Some open area where all the males congregate together and they display together and they can all see each other, right? And the females all come to the lek and they copulate with dominant birds that are in the center of the lek, and then they leave. The lek stays at the same place every year. So if you want to go see sage grouse, you can go back to the same leks year after year. But what turkeys use is a form of lek we refer to it as an exploded lek. And basically, you just take a sage grouse lek and you blow it up on the landscape. So once you explode it, I refer to it as like little light bulbs. And you have some light bulbs that are really big, like this blue light bulb in the center, which is a group of, say, 6 toms, like in that picture. And then you have these smaller light bulbs that are singleton males that are by themselves, that are older. You have pairs and threes. And from year to year, as production occurs or does not, we make young turkeys. The light bulbs get brighter or get dimmer as production ebbs and flows from year to year. When the light bulb blinks out, what we're discovering, as I'm going to show you, is sometimes it never turns on again, that the light bulb just disappears. So unlike those sage grouse that can see each other, right, they can see their competition, these birds can't see each other. So they gobble to maintain these social hierarchies. So you see one light bulb that gobbles, and then the next group gobbles, and the next group gobbles. And so if you go into a population where you've got a lot of birds, you hear, as groups of birds are responding to each other. That's the way they're supposed to behave. And within this system, one of two things happens. Either hens visit these leks, so these 6 toms may go to a spot every morning and stand there and wait on the hens to show up, or they follow the hens around. So the lek either is stable or it moves about the landscape. But the bottom line is it's exploded. So there are pockets of turkeys, and then there's a lot of areas that don't have breeding turkeys. That's the way they're supposed to function. Within the groups of hens that are in these leks, there's a dominant hen that breeds first, and then there's a subordinate hen that breeds second, and then third, and then fourth. Rank matters. So what you see is this natural progression during the nesting season where you have hens within a group. One starts nesting today, the next starts nesting tomorrow, the next starts nesting on Friday, and that's by design. And I'm going to show you kind of what that looks like with data. Okay, so if you look at the winter flocks, so this is where you're headed in the next few months. you're going to see these little pockets of turkeys that are out and about right now form these large winter flocks. And within those flocks, you're going to see they're segregated by sex and age. So within female flocks, you're going to see adult females and juvenile females together, staying together in the winter. And then you're going to see juvenile males that are all together, ones that were hatched this year. And then you're going to see adult males that are all together. And they don't hang out with each other. They may be in the same general areas, but they're not socially together. And within those female flocks, if you read literature from 30 years ago, we refer to them as siblings. In other words, there are females within that flock that are related to each other. Usually, we thought it was a function of one of those hens hatched some of those other hens that are in that group that previous summer, and so her juvenile females are hanging around with her. It's gregarious, yet it's structured. So if you look at that group of hens, there may be two separate pecking orders inside of that flock, where 5 or 6 of those females are in one pecking order and the rest are in the other pecking order. So they don't fight amongst themselves, they fight within themselves, if that makes sense. That's why you often see flocks of turkeys where there seems to be constant strife. They're constantly head pecking and chasing and vocalizing at each other because of those hierarchies. Then what happens is you see that blow up, and that lek blows up, and you're going to see these winter flocks dissolve into something that looks like this, where you have, say, a group of these 8 hens, and you have a group of toms that overlap their range. Like I said, they either walk around with them and display, or they go to a spot or multiple spots and they display and wait on those hens to come to them. Within that group of toms, there's a dominant breeder that research has clearly shown he breeds most of the breeding that occurs within that group. It's from him. Do other toms breed? Yes, but he's the lion's share of most of the copulations in that group. And what we've thought based on earlier literature is that turkeys practice kin selection. And that's a really abstract thing, but I'll explain it very briefly. What that means is within that group of those 3 toms there, they are true siblings, where they were hatched out of the same clutch. They're brothers. And since only one of them is the dominant bird, it makes more sense for the brothers to display and help their brother, the dominant bird, obtain breeding rights, because they indirectly benefit from a fitness perspective. They may not breed themselves, but genetically it makes sense for them. That's kin selection. And we've thought that uniformly fits to wild turkeys based on some literature many, many years ago. So you look at that picture, and if you go back and look at data published years ago, those were believed to be siblings. Now, when you and I think of the word sibling, what do you think about a true, like a brother or sister, right? You have the same mother, same father, or at least same mother. Well, in reality, what we're finding is that's not true. This was based on observations of tagged wild flocks that were out at basically in the Midwest. And it was framed partially around the belief that these hens that ended up together in the summer with their poults were related to each other. In other words, if you hatch your clutch in the summer, you're going to go find someone you're related to, and if she has her own clutch that she hatched, you're going to amalgamate together and hang out together. And therefore, there's already this degree of relatedness before you ever get to your winter flock, and therefore you're more likely to benefit from hanging around with someone you're related to. And one study has really largely driven this narrative. One study back 20 years ago that used molecular markers that found some evidence for this essentially has been widely accepted as being the gospel. And that's not what we're seeing at all. This figure in the bottom left is the mean degree of relatedness, and that's 4 populations, one of which is not hunted. I'm going to talk more about this orange population. The population is not actually orange, but the histogram shows it is. And then you've got on the far left, you have a heavily hunted population in Georgia. You have a lightly hunted population in southeast Louisiana. You have a population that's has no hunting in South Carolina. And then you have a population that's heavily hunted in West Louisiana. And what you see is one of those populations, the degree of relatedness within these groups of males is really high. But in the other populations, the degree of relatedness is very, very low, if not non-existent, suggesting that a lot of these males that are hanging around together are not related to each other at all. And what's really interesting is within one population, you'll see one group of males that are together that are brothers, true brothers. And then the next group, a mile down the road, none of them are related to each other. And then the next group, you may have two of the males that may be distantly related and the rest are not related at all. It seems to be highly variable across the landscape. And when we started trying to figure out, okay, is there a precedent for that and why may that function the way it does, we started digging around in mannequin research. Mannequins are a bird that use exploded lekking mating systems. And in those birds, it seems that kin selection is much more common in areas where these mannequins can see each other. But when you start getting into really brushy, thick habitats, kin selection breaks down. And we think it's probably because they can no longer associate with each other. They can't see each other. They don't know if they're seeing a true sibling that they've spent time with. And therefore, kin selection just breaks down. And if that's the case, which is what our data suggests, then it's not something uniform in wild turkeys. It may be very location specific. So let's go back to these brood flocks. So what you're looking at here is a hen in the top left. And then over on the right, can you kind of tell that those are younger birds, but they're different sizes. So these are all young birds that were hatched the year that Tess took that picture. And you've got some that are several weeks older than the others. They're all females. They're all hanging around together. That's what we call a brood flock. And they've been hanging around each other since they were the age of those, say, 2-week-old poults in the top left. And those birds become those winter flocks. They stay together until the winter. And then within that winter flock, there are some birds that are related to each other. Now, what we've thought, based on data years ago, is that the birds that were related to each other would stay together, right? In that there's some benefit to hanging around with a true sister or with your mother versus not. And we found that none of that is true. That when those winter flocks dissolve into those social groups, remember that group of 8 hens in one of the previous slides, we've believed that within that group right there that most of those hens were related to each other. And in reality, they're not. About 60% of the hens, when they split up out of that winter flock, they end up going to where there's no relatives around them. And then within the groups, once they get there, 94% of all the contacts, meaning they're hanging around together, literally, like you and I are together. They're not related to each other. And then it gets even more pronounced. Once they start laying eggs, they completely avoid any related individuals, which is really interesting because what that suggests to us is what we used to think would be a benefit of hanging around with kin. They perceive it as a cost. There's actually a cost to associating with kin during reproduction. And I'm going to talk about what that might be, but so it kind of discounts a lot of what we thought was going on. And we're also finding that turkeys commonly parasitize each other's nest. You know what a cowbird is, a brown-headed cowbird, right? Classic nest parasite, goes and lays an egg and some other bird's clutch and allows that mom to do its job. This is actually quite common in wild turkeys, much more common than we once believed. So, interestingly, with turkeys is the parasites also nest on their own. So unlike, say, a cowbird, wild turkeys, the parasitism we're seeing, is a single female will go lay one egg or even 2 or 3 eggs in someone else's clutch, and then she will go lay her own clutch. Or she will be laying her own clutch and also at the same time laying eggs in another female's clutch. We've seen that commonly as well. For that to work, if you think about it, the parasite needs to monitor the host behavior, right? They need to understand, well, if they lay their egg in this clutch, if they lay it, say, just before the incubation process or very early in the laying sequence, then these eggs are not going to be synchronized with each other. So they need to monitor that host if they're going to parasitize it. And what we've seen with wild turkeys is they do that by scoping each other out when they're laying. So during that 2 week, it takes them about 2 weeks to lay a clutch. During that 2 weeks, almost all of the parasitism events are driven by hens, by females that are hanging around with each other during the laying period. So they're hanging around, and suddenly this hen disappears. And she moves over in some part of her range where her conspecific saw her do it. So she knows that bird just headed east, maybe I'll start tracking her. And they end up spending time in the same areas, and we believe that's how they monitor the host nest. But kinship isn't at play. So in other words, these parasites are not related to each other. Again, back to the kind of the cost of hanging around with kin. And we're starting to wonder this. If you go back and look in the earlier literature on turkeys, nest parasitism was never even mentioned. But during conversations with a gentleman who used to captively rear birds and imprint them to himself, he noted to me that the birds that he would imprint would become very uncomfortable when they could see him watching them as they were trying to go lay an egg. They would hide from him, they would squat down, they would try to avoid him being able to see them, suggested to him that they were concerned about his presence. He thought it was from a kind of a, hey, I don't want you to come eat my nest. But he also was wondering whether they perceived him as a predation risk, even though they looked at him as a quote unquote turkey. And if you look in the literature on other birds, you see this very clear link between increases in parasitism as predation risk increases. In other words, as risk increases, the probability that hens would adapt this strategy becomes higher and higher and higher. And if you kind of think about it, it makes sense. As your individual risk of losing your clutch increases, maybe it makes more sense at some point to put at least one egg in someone else's basket to spread the risk across the landscape. And if you kind of look at like raccoons, species that all evidence suggests are at historic apex levels, then perhaps this is a reproductive strategy that has evolved over the past few decades. And the lack of information suggesting it back, say, 30 years ago was simply a reflection that it was not as common as it is now. And as an aside, we lose about 80% of all of our nests on these study populations, so predation is quite high. One other thing we've learned that actually I have to eat crow and say that my own published research was wrong. I published research back in the 1990s suggesting that turkeys selected nest sites. In other words, they walked around and they picked the best spot and then they put eggs there. And that is summarily false. They don't do any of that. In fact, what we've seen now with the advent of GPS is they don't visit the nest site until the first day they lay the first egg. They don't go prospecting and pick areas. In fact, they don't go anywhere near that eventual nest site until the day they fly down and lay the first egg. So we've commonly focused on measuring vegetation around nest sites because we've believed that she went and selected that spot, when in reality she really didn't. She found it the day of and put an egg there. What we've also seen is that during the laying period, so once they pick that spot and say, yep, that'll do, they then start prospecting. They start walking around in their range and identifying areas where we think they feel safe, and there's lots of resources. And then where do you think they go once they start incubating? When they take a break every day during incubation to go recess, they go back to those spots that they've prospected during the 2-week laying period. And what that suggests to me anyway, and others that I collaborate with, is maybe we've spent all this time focusing on nesting habitat and prospecting and selection during nesting, when in reality, it's that 2-week laying period where she really focuses on resource availability. And maybe we need to look at her behaviors during that period and try to figure out, what is she targeting, that instead of looking at the vegetation at the nest, which seems largely irrelevant, frankly, to their success. We don't see any patterns between what the nest looks like and whether it hatches or not. So let's shift focus to males. They're sexier and more colorful. Obviously, I mean, this is one of the most popular game birds in North America, particularly popular here in Nebraska. So if you look at turkey hunting, spring turkey hunting has exploded in popularity. So back in the 1980s and 90s, when I was cutting my teeth as a turkey hunter, spring turkey hunting was really not very popular. And now it's extremely popular. Gobbling is important to people like me. So that's a bird I harvested here in Nebraska this spring. The fact that that bird displays and gobbles and was reactive to me and I could engage with him, that's important to me. That's what drives hunter satisfaction, is gobbling activity. What we don't know is actually how males respond to hunting. This has been something that we've kind of assumed for years, that turkeys are kind of like deer or squirrels or rabbits or any other game species, that they just kind of interact with a hunter and they quote unquote get over it. But now we have the technology to study kind of individual behaviors, which I'm going to talk to you about. You often see lots and lots of references in the literature based on data from the 1990s suggesting that hunting is pretty much irrelevant. That as long as you only harvest, say, 30% or less of your males in the spring, that the activity of hunting itself means nothing to wild turkeys. They just kind of deal with it. There's also a lot of debate about spring harvest itself. So if you kill a bird in the spring, would he have died anyway? In other words, was it a compensatory form of mortality? Or is that true additive mortality? In other words, if you didn't shoot him that April, he would have survived until the next April. And that's a fundamental difference there, because if harvest is additive, then protecting males from harvest means that there should be a realization or an expectation that those same males are going to be in the population to be harvested the following spring, versus compensation, where if you don't harvest them, they're going to die anyway. To answer some of these questions, you really need a population that isn't exposed to hunting, and no hunting activity, no disturbance. And then ergo, you see the Savannah River site, which is a population we started studying in 2014. In the past 3 years, we've added a lot of spatial data and reproductive data to the other work we were doing. And I'm going to show you what we're finding, which is, to me, is pretty telling. So this is gobbling activity by week. Okay, that's total number of gobbles heard. And that red line is April 1st. And in the Deep South, April 1st is considered kind of a benchmark. That's when you see a lot of states right around the early part of April are opening their spring hunting seasons. We've always kind of thought that April 1st was that day where that's kind of a big day in the turkey world in the South, that a lot of nesting's ongoing and things are really ramping up. And what you're seeing with these green arrows is that first green arrow is that peak, right? That's kind of when you see this crescendo of gobbling activity. It ramps up, and then you go fast forward, you're going almost a month, and then you're seeing another green arrow where you see this another little bump in gobbling activity. And this is what gobbling looks like without hunting. You see a perfect bell curve where gobbling activity ramps up, it peaks, it remains at high levels, and then it slowly wanes. And the reason it slowly wanes is because males, go figure guys, are just persistent. They just won't stop. So they keep gobbling and they keep displaying and they keep hoping that there's a chance, right? There's got to be one more chance. So they keep behaving in an irrational manner. That's what we've seen. This is all of the years on SRS combined. But I will point out, within an individual year, the data looks all the same. It's a perfect bell curve. This is our hunted populations, all put in the same. And what you see is the number of gobbles is the exact same. So prior to the onset of hunting, gobbling activity in these non-hunted populations is the same as in our intensively hunted population. There's a lot of gobbling early in the reproductive season. But then right around that April 1st, when hunting in most of these populations starts, you see this predictable decline. And by this point, which is going to be important to you, around April 15th, gobbling has declined dramatically. And you may say, well, that doesn't matter. It's just a vocalization. Well, again, that vocalization is an important part of their mating system. It helps structure their populations on the landscape. And it's pretty clear that you get this serious skew once hunting starts, which is kind of intuitive, and that's been shown before. But this is where it gets more interesting. So this is nest initiation dates for all of our hunted populations. And this is about 1,000 birds worth of data. Initiation is when the first egg was laid, okay? So about 2 weeks before she started sitting there. So this would be, you would expect it to be in early April. That median date is April the 12th, okay? And I just threw these numbers out there. So 75%, that's the percentage of nests that were initiated, meaning 25% of the hens didn't lay a nest. And then of those 75%, 20% on average are hatching. And of those 20%, about 30% of those broods are surviving 1 month. On those populations, that equates to about 7% of all nests producing one or more surviving poults. So not very productive. And then of those hens that lose that first clutch, about 25% of them try again, okay? So look at that date, April 12th, same latitude, same landscape, same habitat types. And this is, granted, smaller sample size. Our median date is April 5th. The mean is a day and a half later. And if you know anything about basic descriptive stats, having a mean and a median that tight, that tells you something. So if you look, the parenthetical values are from our hunted populations, and to the left is from SRS 3 years of data. 85% versus 75% nest initiation, 33% nest success, 40% brood success, 52% re-nesting rates. And if you put all that together, they're about 80% more productive than our hunted populations. So there does, at least at this point, appear to be a reproductive effect of this activity, which is translating to much higher productivity in populations, or a population that's not hunted. So what's causing this? Okay, this looks messy, but it's not. The left is just individual hens within a social group. So this would be that group of 8 hens that was in that slide with that group of toms. And that red arrow is pointing to when the first egg was laid by the first hen. And what you see is from the, so 61160, first hen, the next day, the next bird in the social group lays an egg. The next day, and then you see that green arrow is April 7th. That was the opening day of hunting season on this side in Louisiana. And this is a very common figure for all of our social groups that are hunted. Everything slows down. The black dots get farther and farther apart. You see these stars, and what the stars are referencing is, see that the red dots are when hens that lost their first clutch have already started initiating their second clutch. And what you see, if you look at the stars, is you've got birds that are initiating their first clutch within a group, And there are already hens that have started their second clutch within that group. And what this tells me is, and there's comparable literature with, say, prairie chickens, is once you start removing males, the breeding process slows down. It may necessarily not always be just dominant birds you're removing. It's just the process of removing males, kind of everything slows down. And work on fallow deer, which also use Lex, has shown the same thing. And then you see those two green dots, that's actually third nest that were attempted. So if you put all those together, about 66% of those hens had not even started laying their first egg when hunting started. And that's why we think we're seeing a lot of these prolonged nesting seasons and lower success, because we're kind of disrupting things. Once the process starts, we go in and we start disrupting their natural mating behavior, and the consequences is this. This looks even messier, but it's not. I'm going to explain it to you. And when I explain it to you, I hope it makes sense. You look at it and it's like, oh my God, that's spaghetti. I love spaghetti. What's better than pasta, right? So on the left, you've got an axis that's daily gobbling activity. And that's the up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. And then what happens when you get to that black bar, that vertical bar? That's the first day of hunting season. Up and down, up and down, up and down, 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 done. And that's gobbling activity on a heavily hunted site. Okay. Another one of the data series is the proportion of females that are laying and incubating. And that's the bell curve that comes up and tails off slowly down to the right. So what you're seeing is this natural increase in nesting activity while gobbling is decoupled. Gobbling activity is going down, nesting activity is going up. And then you see that last data series is the proportion of harvest, that's the triangles. And what you see there is about 80% of all the toms that were going to be shot are dead before nesting starts. And this is very common in our hunted populations. We think if you put all that together, that's why we see these differences in success and productivity in these populations, because there's a disruption to the process. We've also seen some really interesting things like this. Male turkeys see us as a deadly risk, as they should. And they don't have to get shot to have that perception. So we've seen collected data sets like the one on the left, where you've got a hunter in blue. That's a hunter wearing a GPS unit. And the yellow movement track is a tom that's wearing a GPS unit. And they meet at the red star. And then the tom runs 1.5 miles to the east to a private track. And he stays there the rest of the hunting season. 2 days after hunting stopped, he returned to the public land. We see that very commonly. We've seen situations, many situations like this on the right, where a tom is hanging out in an area where he spent the entire month of April. He interacts with a hunter, and he goes to a part of his range he's never been to. As long as we've tracked him, we never had him up there. He died 2 days later, 2 days after he got there. He was shot by another hunter. So we're seeing, in some cases, these very dramatic movements. And then on the flip side, we see something like this. This figure on the top right, the green is a hunter track. The red is a turkey's track, a tom. And what happens in this scenario, we interviewed this guy. He goes in, he hears this bird gobbling in the tree. He gets close enough to him, he thinks. He starts calling to him. He keeps looking at his cell phone or his watch, and he decides, the bird's not coming, I've got to go to work. He gets up and he walks, you can see quickly, you see how long the movement tracks are, the arrows. He's covering some serious ground, probably thinking he's going to lose his job. He gets back, he's headed back 10 o'clock to wherever he's going, and the turkey, 2 hours after the hunter leaves, ends up in the exact same spot where the hunter was sitting. So this bird has a strategy of sit around and wait. There's no reason to take off and walk a mile. Just chill out. Check your surroundings, be hyper vigilant, very careful. And what you see on this bottom left is, this is behavioral. We've been doing a lot of work with personalities. We're building behavioral profiles for these toms. And what we're seeing is there's no two birds that are the same. They all act differently. So in this case, you've got 3 birds down here that relative to public access points, these would be parking areas and trails where hunters like you and I would walk in. Some of these birds hang out fairly close to those areas. Now, fairly close, 2,000 meters isn't fairly close. But then there's some guys like Tom number 1 over here, 4,000 meters on average. I mean, this guy stayed away from public access points to the degree that he became very difficult to monitor. This was one of a bird we had to use aircraft to monitor frequently because he would go so far away from access points. The take home is there's really no average Tom. They're all unique, but clearly what we're doing is causing changes to their behavior. And as an aside, we're also seeing the same thing with females. We're seeing that females during the hunting season are exhibiting the same trends in that they're moving farther away from roads and they're avoiding areas that hunters are targeting. And as soon as hunting ceases, they resume acting the way they were prior to hunting, which is pretty interesting. So what about survival? That was another thing we were interested in. So does hunting impact survival? And this is a cumulative survival curve. Look at the 0. That's the day turkey season starts. So what you can see is before turkey season starts, man, you're good. And then you're not. Hunting season starts, a common juveniles, this would be 1-year-olds at the top. We're seeing this commonly across the southeastern states. Juvenile harvest is almost non-existent, which is quite a difference than it was 20 years ago. We think probably this is just hunters becoming more selective. They're targeting adults, which is fine. You see this dramatic decrease as soon as turkey season starts, and that equates to hunted populations having about a 54% annual survival. And that's based on data using about 1,400 birds on public and private lands, actually. Our non-hunted population, we have 83% annual survival. The only cause of mortality is obviously predation, which I'm going to show you. So a dramatic decrease in survival, suggesting that you could carry over birds from one year to the other with a reasonable expectation that they're not going to die from some other cause. When you plot this out across our study sites, and yes, we had harvest mortality of 70% in one of our sites in a given year. What you see is annual survival across sites. You see this very strong regression line. Almost, I mean, it looks perfect, right? It's beautiful. Suggesting that there's a very clear additive response here, that in the absence of harvest, these birds would be carried over until the following year. When you look at these hazard rates, I'm going to point you to, see the big red peak, right? Well, that's essentially the hazard rate associated with adult harvest. Go figure, if you're an adult, you're going to have a high hazard during hunting season. But what I want you to actually look at is what's inside the box, which is we're seeing identical harvest rates on public and private lands, equating to right at about 30%, 29 point something percent. And that's pretty telling because we've always assumed that harvest was a lot higher on public lands because there's more pressure. But what you see in the turkey hunting world is sometimes you can see extraordinary pressure on private lands. And it appears that if you give us enough opportunity as turkey hunters, we're going to harvest pretty much the same percentage of the birds, regardless of whether we're competing with a lot of other hunters or only amongst ourselves. The other thing you'll notice is this predation rate, which is the blue and the black curve, are almost identical on hunted versus non. There's a small percentage of toms that are going to die from predation regardless. That's the same on hunted versus non-hunted. So that's the 83% survival on non-hunted population. It's because the remaining percentage is lost primarily to predation. So where are we headed? If you look right now, and I know you don't because you're not a good turkey goober like I am, but this is my 30th year studying this bird. And there's more research ongoing today than there ever has been in my career. And I think that speaks volumes about two things. One, there's a lot of people passionate about this bird, but more problematic is there's a lot of concern in the public about these ongoing declines and what may be causing these declines. So there's enough interest and there's enough agency concern to stimulate the amount of money that's being spent right now, which is quite a lot. We have all these evolving techniques that we're starting to use, like machine learning tools, neural networks, which is what we process the gobbling data, really complicated and interesting, like movement analyses where you can go in and predict behaviors based on previous behaviors. And all these things are evolving so quickly, but I'm not. So like I'm going to retire because it just blows my mind, all these tools that are out there. But I think probably what you're going to see is as these data sets become more advanced, you're going to see the ability to make agency recommendations that are so far advanced relative to what we've done in the past that it will offer us as academics the opportunity to inform agencies in a way that's much more surgical than it's been in the past. And I will just point out, if you collectively look at the data that's just collected this year in the United States, if you were to put it all together, it would be the most spatially comprehensive data set 1 year ever collected on wild turkeys. So if you back up and you take the last 15 years, and you put all of that in a pot, which is what I do, that's what I try to do, you're dealing with a data set that will never be replicated. And we really, at this point, my opinion is we have to harness it. We have to use it to the best of our abilities to answer the relevant questions. And that's all I have. I know I can see two yawners, a couple of eye closers, laid back in the cedars. No questions? No way I'll get off that easy. Do you have the microphone? I think they want to, so the people that are on Zoom can hear it. Okay.
Students, credit. I hear there's 3 of you. Don't make John point them out.
So there's some of you that had to be here. Okay, raise your hand if you had to be here.
Oh, they're not going to now.
Now that yeah, one person like,
All right.
a third of the audience was strong-armed into being here. Yeah, that's helpful.
Okay. Thank you.
So if there's a staggered lane, is there any indication that there's differential survival based on when the chicks hatch?
Yes, excellent question. So the early bird gets the worm. In the turkey world, we've seen clearly that early nests have much higher survival. And within the nest that hatch early, brood survival is much higher. So not only is the nest more successful, but the brood itself is more successful. So there's a true benefit to being able to be early in the reproductive period and not be one of those hens that are trying to get that process started a month into the breeding period. Yeah, good question, for sure. And as an aside, we've seen, so I pointed out that there are dominant hens within these flocks, right? And those dominant hens breed first, they nest first. Well, if the early birds are more successful and the dominant birds are the early birds, then it really speaks volumes about the need for those birds to get on the ground and get nesting, because we've also seen that if you hatch this year, you have about a 65% chance to hatch next year. If you don't hatch this year, you have an 8% chance of hatching next year. So what that means is most of the poults that are in our populations are being produced by a small number of the hens, kind of speaking to how important those hens are and how they need to be able to get the process started early. Yep.
That's okay. From the student row, how's that?
Yeah, so I guess my question was, so I admit to being a relatively novice turkey hunter, but some states, for big game mammals, seasons will blink in and out. There'll be multiple rifle seasons. Are there any states or any opportunities where turkey season might start and then stop and then start again? And could that disruption of the hunting season maybe help with these potential issues you're seeing with the breeding season?
Yes, there's actually, so there are agencies take a broad brush of different approaches to that question. Some agencies will have, for instance, on some public lands, you'll see these stop and start quotas where you may have a 2-day hunt followed by 5 days off, and then another 2-day hunt followed by 5 days off. And what they're trying to do is limit the harvest early, limit the disturbance, limit the pressure, in hopes of, I think, primarily to improve the experience for as long as possible during the season. You see some states that have, like Wisconsin has literally, this week and then another week and then another week, and you're buying tags for each week. You have some states like South Carolina, for instance, that they will have, they'll limit you to a single bird the first week of the season. And what they're trying to do is minimize the harvest early, because what we've seen with turkeys is most of the birds that are going to be killed are killed the first 2 weeks. So if you can force hunters to only kill, say, one bird instead of the 2 they're allowed, you delay some of that harvest. Maybe you're not preventing it, but you're at least delaying it into the breeding season more. So yes, you see all kinds of strategies to try to get at what you ask about. Yep. And I suspect, unfortunately, you're probably going to see a lot more of that in the future at a broader scale, because it's a very popular activity. And when there's more demand than there is supply, then your economic model has to change, right? So the agencies are in a really tough position because they're trying to manage opportunity, recognizing that we want opportunity. We want to be out there. We want to hear birds. And we don't want to be told we can't do this, or we can't, behave the same way that we've behaved before. But the realities of where this bird is in a lot of its range, and in some part of its range, they're doing quite well. But throughout the South and much of the Midwest, it's pretty much the same story. Good. That's the coerced questions.
So we got one from Zoom here, from Chris Picorni. Michael, is it possible that part of the reason gobbling reduces during a hunted population is because perhaps the birds that do the majority of the gobbling are being shot and removed from the population?
Yes. Yes. Hi, Chris. Good to hear from you. Yes, but that's not the sole explanation, because we're not killing all of the vocal birds. I suspect we're killing a high percentage of them, but the data suggests that we're not only removing vocal birds, but we're also changing the behavior of the remaining birds. And what we see with that, for instance, the autonomous recording units that we use to record gobbling data, we will have GPS marked toms that are gobbling before hunting starts, that are in the same part of the landscape, and they're gobbling, and we're recording their data. We know they're there. And then once they're pressured, they're still there, but they don't gobble anymore. So it's a combination of vocal birds being shot and other birds, including vocal birds, changing how they're behaving. And it's also consistent with, prior to hunting, you typically will see a pulse of gobbling early in the morning. The birds will gobble a lot in the tree on the roost, which they're supposed to do. They're trying to project sound. And then once they hit the ground, they typically don't gobble as much, because their behavior says, and that's why I tried to lay this out for you, go where those hens are going to go, and therefore you don't have to gobble anymore, or you're following the hens around so you can see her. There's no incentive to gobble anymore. So naturally you see gobbling wane as the day progresses. But once hunting starts, almost all the gobbling is in the tree when they're roosted. And as soon as they fly down, they stop, which makes sense to me from a risk standpoint. Don't risk bringing attention to yourself, gobble enough to tell those females you're there and then shut up. There's a lot of pressure.
My name is Shabani Mullah, PhD student. Thank you so much for a great presentation on Turkey. And I saw Turkey last spring. It was my first time.
Okay.
We don't have Turkey in Africa, and I went to Kano to see Turkey, and the way I saw them there, I asked so many questions. Are there some diseases that this Turkey can bring to the population? Because people are going there to visit them, and I saw them in huge number. There's a lot of stuff going on there. So I want to ask you, as a scientist who be doing research in Turkey, what are the common outbreak or diseases that affect Turkey?
So disease issues. So turkeys forever have dealt with issues like avian pox, which is a very common disease. It's not a dramatic source of mortality. They'll survive it a lot. You'll have diseases like avian blackhead, which are common in domestic flocks that leak over into wild flocks. But one of the diseases, and I won't ask Sarah to pronounce it, kind of inside joke, is a proliferative virus, lymphoproliferative disease virus. That's a virus that's gaining a lot of attention because it appears that, one, this virus is quite common in populations. Prevalence in some of our populations in the South is 75+%, meaning almost all the birds have it. There's also evidence with viruses like this virus that it can affect reproduction. It can reduce clutch sizes. It can we think that it may be linked to some changes in behavior. We're trying to study that now. So maybe the fact that this virus is so prevalent has some consequences to reproduction that may be part of what we're seeing. I don't think it's driving what we're seeing, but there is growing concern among a lot of agencies that this virus is so prevalent. Well, what does it mean? So there's a lot of work ongoing now where we're trying to link our demographic, like our nest data, to did she have the virus or not, right? So does that answer your question?
Does he need a break?
All right, we got a question from Will Inselman. Hey, Will. Speaking to the ongoing research in Nebraska, would you expect to see similar results with states in the northern Great Plains like Nebraska, South Dakota, Minnesota as those you presented today?
As far as reproductive data, yes, I would. And just looking at the data from this year, which I'll caveat, it's 1 year of data, but we did see comparable rates of nest initiation, a little bit lower than what you see in other states, a little bit higher nest success than you see in many other states. But when you collectively look at how many birds were produced, very similar to what we've seen in a lot of our southeastern states. So indicative of lambda that could be below 1, meaning the population is declining. Yep. We'll see. I mean, that's why we're here. In a few years, we should have a rigorous enough data set to answer Will's question. But my prediction is it's going to be very similar.
No.
She can ask anything she wants.
Oh, can I ask one?
Yeah.
Mine isn't really as much about what you have talked about than more about the habitat side. You talked a little bit about when they initiate nest that they're not really going to a place that they've scoped out, but you've also talked a little bit previously, you were talking about brood cover and how important that is.
Mhm.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about that and what that looks like and why that's an important thing?
Yeah. So in my travels, across the country and looking at the data sets that my folks collect. I don't collect this data. I just tell you what it means. I have people that, like people sitting in this audience, they're the ones that do all the work. But when I go to study sites that my folks are working on, I don't see nesting habitat as being that limited, because turkeys will nest in a lot of different places, and we don't see any links between what the vegetation looks like and whether the nest hatches or not. It appears to be much more random. It appears to be, does she end up putting her eggs in an area with a lot of predator activity? If she does, she's probably going to get smoked. If she doesn't, she might hatch. But what I do see is a dramatic lack of brood cover. And to understand what brood cover looks like, so, and this, I didn't present any of this data, but I'll explain to you very briefly. So turkeys go from being this big when they're popping out of the egg and running around to being this big in a month. And they go from literally little parasites that can't do anything for themselves except peck to being able to fly away from predators in 2 weeks. So they are molting very, very quickly. They're changing feathers daily. They don't even look like themselves from one day to the next. And they go from eating only insects the first 10 days to eating everything in their grass a week later. So they change dramatically. They're really plastic. So brood cover when they're this big is very different than what it is when they're this big. So what you see with broods is the first week to 2 weeks, they get crushed. And then once they get 2 weeks old, their survival increases, and there's a reason for that. Early brood cover, to understand what a 1 week old poult needs, lay down on your stomach. And if you can see in front of you, then so can they. The next thing you do is roll over on your back. And if you roll over on your back and you look around you and you can identify something to go hide under, they can too. Last thing is pop up on one knee. And if you can see over and through the vegetation, so can the hen. If you put those three things together, I challenge you to go out on Nebraska landscape or anywhere else and find me more than about 5 to 10% of the landscape that actually fits those requirements. I can take you to thousands of acres where a hen can sit there and hide, but I can't take you to many where a brood could thrive, where those three conditions are met. And it's because early brood habitat has to be disturbed. There has to be some disturbance to the vegetation. So think sod-forming grasses and things that are really hard to move through. They can't deal with that. Will they? Yes. They'll try to make a living in it, but they don't. Once they're 2 weeks old, all bets are off. They now start fluttering off the ground to capture insects. They start herding insects together. They start cooperatively foraging with each other. The hen no longer runs the ship. When they're this big, she walks them to places where she thinks they can make it. Once they're 2 weeks old, they take her, and she follows along. All she's doing is watching, keeping everybody safe. She sees something, she vocalizes, she clucks, she putts, everybody takes off. The first 2 weeks, all she's doing is this. She's looking around, looking around, looking around. So if you go out and look at a place that a 1 week old brood uses, if they lived, it's very specific. It fits those three requirements. If you go out to an area where a 20-day-old brood made it, it's all over the map. And we've actually gone and GoPro'd hundreds of places where brood, I'm going to start posting this on my website. Early broods, very specific. It's very specific what it looks like. Older broods, it's all over the place. But that is uniformly what I see lacking across the United States when I travel, is a place where I could meet those three requirements. And usually it's the first one. It's not rolling over on my back, finding something to hide under, and it's not being able to see on my knee. It's laying on my stomach and not being able to see in front of me because there's a wall in front of my face. And you may say, well, hell, they'll just climb over it, no big deal. With turkeys, understand when they're this big, they can't thermoregulate. So if they get wet, they die. If you think about heavy dew formation in the spring, I can take you to places in the deep south where I can walk you through a plot that looks beautiful, but the top 6 or 8 inches of vegetation is very dense and it's wet. And you walk through there in the morning, and by the time you get to the other side, your feet are soaking wet. Well, that's a nuisance for you. That's a death wish for a poult. They can't tolerate that. So they have to have bare ground where they can navigate around that and stay dry. And I see that lacking in many, many places that I go. No, I don't mind answering questions. Did you have a question? I thought Scott had a question. Did you have a question, sir?
Oh, yeah.
I don't mind answering your question.
Thanks for being here. We really appreciate you coming up. So Nebraska's been to the top of the game over the last 20 years, and we're on the slide. There's no doubt about that. I know Luke and Nebraska Game and Parks are really trying to get ahead of it. You mentioned a number, and it's been thrown around. So we're only supposed to be harvesting 30% of the adult gobbler population.
So that number, to explain to you where that number came from. So back in the 1990s, there was a gentleman and a colleague that were tasked by the Northeast states to develop a set of recommendations for how do you design a turkey season? What's the most appropriate turkey season framework? To do that, they used the data collected in the Missouri research project that spanned 10 years, the entire 1980s. And they used that data to develop a model to predict what percentage could we harvest predicated on what we're producing. And the outcome of that model was 30% or less is sustainable. Now, here's some caveats. Number one, the poult per hen ratio used in that means the number of poults observed in the summer was over 3. And at least in the southeastern states, we have not been over 3 in over 15 years. The percentage of juvenile hens in the fall flocks in that data set was 3 to 1. We're at 0.15 to 1. And the capture data from this winter in Nebraska was the same. Very few juvenile females. So that 30% is predicated on production values that are not realistic for where we are now. So what is the right number? We don't know. That's why we need the information. So, and where I have a postdoc doing this now. What is the most appropriate harvest rate given your productivity and your hen survival? So for instance, some years we see, this year for instance, hen survival during the reproductive season across many of our sites was very low, 50%. Other years it's 80%. But let's just look at this year. So this year, if you lose half of your reproductively active females and you're only producing 1.5 poults per hen, then she didn't even replace herself with a female. And then to catch up, what do you have to do? You have to be way above 2 poults per hen, if not 3 poults per hen, to try to eventually catch up. And the data show that these declines have not just been dramatic. It's just been very slow, up and down, up and down, but down and down and down. And we've known for decades that turkeys kind of oscillate. They go up and down, right? But our populations are doing that same up and down, but the trend has been down. And yeah, I mean, 30% based on the productivity that we're seeing in many of our populations, it's not sustainable. The question is, well, what is sustainable? And that's where what the agencies are grappling with now is, what is the appropriate percentage that we remove to realize a sustainable population, and more importantly, a sustainable harvest rate, something that we are going to be happy with as turkey hunters, that we're still going to buy hunting licenses and we're going to have high hunter satisfaction, while recognizing that the population is sustainable and doing well. It's a tough ask.
So on the opening date of turkey seasons, I know down south they've moved those later to get out of the breeding cycle.
Yep.
What do you see as the optimal opening date? We have April 15th,
Mhm.
our closest date Saturday to April 15th here in Nebraska. Based on what I've seen and what I've done hunting and what you've seen, in Nebraska, where would we have to move that to get out of their nesting cycle?
Okay, so to answer that question, the same set of recommendations that were used back in the 1990s. As part of those recommendations, there were 4 assumptions that were made, and you'll see where I'm headed. Those assumptions were driven around the recognition that the most conservative opening date would be to time the opening at the peaks and nest incubation, not initiation, not when laying started, but when they actually started incubating. And that a less conservative but biologically reasonable opening date would be when they started laying, because at that point, a lot of breeding is occurring, but you're into the breeding process. So an ultra conservative one, and then a less conservative, but better than not strategy. And what you saw across many states is they summarily dismissed that. And they open seasons based on you and I, pressure, political pressure, because we want to be out there when that bell curve of gobbling activity is starting, right? They're gobbling, I want to be out there. So the seasons progressively got earlier and earlier, but the bird hasn't changed. The nest initiation data is clear. This is, at least in our populations, is a mid-April process. The reality is that many opening dates are way before the time and onset of laying, much less incubation. But Bill's recommendations in the 1990s was open it at the peaks of incubation, and then at that point, there's some percentage of toms that are irrelevant, right? They've completed their breeding. Hens are no longer receptive when they're incubating, so they're not copulating anymore. So at that point, go ahead and remove the 30% or less, and that's sustainable. Based on that, if you look across, and we're actually doing this now, there was a research article that showed this back in 2005. It showed the nesting data for as many states as it's known in, and it showed the opening dates. And the outcome of that analysis was that almost every state was opening their season well before it was recommended in that guideline. Since then, you see a lot of states that are shifting their seasons because they're trying to identify things that they can control, the timing and rate of harvest being one of them. But in general, if you look at opening dates in the South, if you're going to time them around peaks and nesting, it's a first to second week of April thing. And then as you progress farther and farther north in latitude, obviously that opening date would get later and later and later. The balancing act you're trying to do is obviously you want hunters to be satisfied, which is why the opening dates were skewed left to begin with. So at this point, I don't have an answer to your question in Nebraska. That's why we're doing the project, is to collect that reproductive data and allow the agency to understand when these birds are nesting and laying. Trying to get me shot. No. I think probably what you see, and I'm as guilty as this of anybody. If there are turkeys to hunt, I'm going to go hunt them. And that's one reason that I look at my own data with a much a razor sharp eye, if you will, because I'm self-reflective. I know what I do. I chase birds all over the United States. I love it. It's my passion. I don't think there's any question that if you look at the realities of turkey hunting today versus 20 years ago, it's a completely different ballgame, and you know that. We have techniques that are extremely efficient and effective. We have call technology, we have mapping technology, we have camouflage that's incredible, we have blinds, we have, instant access to information. And meanwhile, the bird hasn't changed, we have. So you've got declining populations and hunters that are much more efficient with their time. And you put that together, and to your question, can you hunt them to death? I'd say no. But can we have a disproportionate impact on them given how efficient we are now? I would say yes, which is reflective in the data. Yeah. Yep.